You've worked hard your whole life to get where you are. You've built expertise, earned respect, and climbed to the top of your game. But now it feels as if your brain is not your own. Words vanish mid-sentence, focus slips through your fingers, and all the usual strategies you've developed over time are no longer working. You're exhausted, emotional, and suddenly you're questioning whether you've lost your edge. You haven't. What you may be dealing with is the not-so-fun cocktail of menopause and ADHD. Millions of women around the world are in the same boat, but the research hasn't really caught up yet. I'm Tara Blanchy, an executive and team coach. I love learning about neuroscience and using this knowledge to help others. So I'm thrilled to be part of this podcast series called The Fog and the Fury, where we finally explore what happens when ADHD and menopause collide. Each week, we'll sit down with leading neuroscientists, researchers, and women who know about this firsthand. We'll tackle the biology, the psychology, and the stigma, and we'll share practical and science-based strategies you can actually use. Because the fog is real, the fury is valid, and if you've ever lost your train of thought in the middle of an important meeting, or your brain feels like a computer with too many tabs open, this podcast is for you. Welcome to The Fog and the Fury. I'm Tara Blanchy. Today, I'm joined by Associate Professor Caroline Gurvich, a clinical neuropsychologist and researcher at Monash University. She's also the Deputy Director of the Her Centre, Australia, which is dedicated to advancing women's mental health research. Caroline's work explores how hormones shape cognition and well-being. And today, we're diving into the intersection of ADHD and menopause. Caroline, welcome.
Thank you, Tara. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Caroline, could you introduce yourself in your own words and tell us about your current research focus, please?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, I'm a clinical neuropsychologist. And so neuropsychology is a branch of psychology that's really interested in brain and behavior relationships. And so in my clinical role, I work with a lot of different people who are interested in having assessments about their cognitions or difficulties with aspects of their cognition or wanting to understand their neurotype. And in my research role, I'm particularly interested in women's mental health, which is what Her Centre advocates for and is about. So Her Centre stands for Health, Education and Research. And our research centre, which is at Monash University, is all about women's mental health. And my role in that is really focusing on cognition, so thinking skills and also, I guess, mood in that and mental health. And I've got a particular interest in how hormones or times of hormone change, like menopause or the menstrual cycle or the use of hormones like hormonal contraceptives, how those hormones can influence our cognition, so the way that we think, and our moods, the way that we feel in all different types of people, including ADHD, which is something that's just not really been researched very much at all.
Yes, as I have learned in doing the background to this podcast. So thank you, Caroline. What we might do is just sort of meander through a couple of different topics, but sort of starting with the science, and then we'll sort of tease apart ADHD and menopause and brain fog and everything else that goes into sort of that diagnosis piece. I'd love to hear from you a little bit about the research and the gaps in the research that you're seeing. And then we'll sort of get to some management and treatment options and general advice, if that sounds right with you.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Great. All right. So I might just start with my first question, and that is, how do hormones and a menstrual cycle impact cognition, and why are cognitive changes sometimes amplified during menopause?
Good question. So I think automatically when we think of hormones or reproductive hormones like estrogen and progesterone, they regulate our reproductive cycle and our reproductive functions. And so we think that they're all to do with reproduction. But actually, estrogen and progesterone, they both cross the blood-brain barrier, so they enter our brain. And there are estrogen receptors, so parts of the brain that respond to changes in these chemicals in the brain. So they're actually quite potent, what we call neurosteroids, so quite potent actions in the brain. And the location of these receptors are in brain areas that are really important for our thinking skills. So the front part of our brain, which is where a lot of our executive functions happen. So that's our higher order thinking skills, our ability to plan, to organize, to set goals, to follow through on goals. That's all our executive functions. And they're primarily regulated by the front parts of our brain. And there's lots of estrogen receptors in the front part of our brain. And there's also a lot of estrogen receptors in a part of our brain called the hippocampus, which is really important for memory, and a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is really important in regulating our emotions. So we've kind of learnt this from a lot of animal research, but it really provides the foundation for us to think, oh, these hormones might have an action in our brain. That's kind of the scientific basis for a lot of our understanding. And there's also been some really interesting animal research that was done using rats, and they looked at neurons in the brain, which are parts of the brain that, I guess, provide connections between brain areas. And they saw changes in these neurons across the rat's estrous cycle, which is the rat's menstrual cycle. And it maps perfectly, like they increase in their density across the estrous cycle when estrogen levels increase, and then they reduce as estrogen levels reduce across the rat's estrous cycle. So there's all these really cool science experiments that were done in animals that have really given us a lot of this foundational knowledge that we're now learning how that might apply to people.
Okay. It is an unbelievably interesting field, which makes it a little more fascinating that there's not as much research out there as one would expect. Thank you for that. Could we move on to, so I guess it leads us naturally to ADHD, which, as you've said, is under-recognised in women. So how might, just for the listeners, how might ADHD present in an adult woman?
Yeah, so what we tend to see is that the diagnostic criteria for ADHD was designed around the very stereotypical ADHD boy, so the hyperactive boy, and that was what the diagnostic criteria was built around. And so more and more over recent years, women are presenting with more of the inattentive symptoms. So ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and the diagnosis, according to our diagnostic criteria, can be either inattentive type symptoms, so that might be difficulties sort of regulating your attention, focusing on things that you need to focus on, forgetfulness, those inattentive type things, and or hyperactivity. So you might only have the inattentive symptoms, or you might have a combination of inattention and hyperactive, or only the hyperactive impulsive type symptoms. So more often than not, adult females who are presenting with ADHD tend to have more of that inattention or difficulties regulating their attention. And that can be missed, I think, during childhood and adolescent years, particularly if it's combined with someone who has a personality type that they might be quite, well behaved and trying really hard to do the right thing. So then it introduces a lot of this masking type behavior, and then it can turn into different things and might be misdiagnosed as depression and anxiety, which might coexist with ADHD, or it might be that people are trying really hard to manage their difficulties regulating attention, and then depression and anxiety start to develop as kind of a maladaptive coping function to manage those difficulties. So then it's often at different points in adulthood where people start to present, but we're seeing a lot more women around the perimenopausal years who are presenting with ADHD. And it's not that it's emerging for the first time, it's just that that's a tipping point for them, that they're coming to seek a diagnosis or seek an understanding of why they're really struggling to manage their kind of executive functions and their attention and their ability to regulate their attention and to follow through on tasks. And if it meets the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, it means it's been there always. It's someone's brain type that they're born with, but they've had enough support and they've kind of got through, but it gets to a point where they're either stretched so they can't manage anymore, or perhaps or the hormone changes bring out some of these symptoms a little bit more. But to meet criteria, it means that the symptoms or characteristics of ADHD have been there since childhood years.
Actually, thank you. That was one of the questions I was going to ask you. So what I'm understanding is there's no such thing as late onset ADHD. There would have been characteristics present, and I think I've read in some of the literature prior to the age of 12 being the cutoff.
Yeah, I feel like this is something that's discussed a little bit more now. Like, is there such a thing as an adult onset ADHD or not? Right now, our diagnostic criteria doesn't allow for that diagnosis, so it doesn't exist. Right now, ADHD is something where characteristics, symptoms develop prior to the age of 12, because that's what our diagnostic criteria requires. And our understanding of ADHD is that it's neurodevelopmental, so it's something that develops with your brain development, and it's not something that emerges in adulthood. It could be that something around the time of menopause, like a lot of women talk about this brand new onset executive dysfunction or difficulties regulating attention, managing time, procrastination. These symptoms sometimes emerge for people for the first time during menopause. So that's not ADHD, just because our diagnostic criteria doesn't allow that to be ADHD. Sometimes it looks quite similar, but it might be called menopausal brain fog or called something else because it just manifests right then, and there's no history of that or of those characteristics being part of someone's life up until that point. So it's might look the same, but it's something different, and it's potentially caused by something different as well.
Okay, no, that's and I thank you. I've heard that before in some of the podcasts I've been listening to as well. But is there can some of the symptoms be categorized? Are some of them more sort of memory related, and then there are others that are quite clearly more about executive functioning?
Yeah. So there hasn't been a huge amount of work in this space, but it's something that I'm really interested in. And clinically and through our research, we tend to see primarily this during menopause, we see this change in learning efficiency. I'd say that's the most common description of or neuropsychological change that we see. So people have, particularly with verbal learning, people aren't as efficient in their ability to learn and recall new pieces of information and then retrieve that information. So for that memory presentation of if we want to call it brain fog or cognitive symptoms of menopause, so this is independent of ADHD, this is just menopause. So as memory type symptoms, people talk about forgetting things, like walking into a room, forgetting why, or just not being as good as remembering things. So if someone shouts something out in the corridor, previously they were always able to remember those things and be quite efficient in their ability to recall things, but they're just not as efficient anymore. Or they might have difficulties with word retrieval. So that tip of the tongue phenomena,
Yep.
you know, when you can't find the right word, you know the word, but you just can't get it when you need it. So those kind of symptoms, and that falls really broadly in the realm of memory, but does rely on good attention skills to be able to perform those memory tasks. And then I think there's this other presentation that some people experience, which is more like an executive dysfunction. So difficulties with planning, with organization, there's more procrastination, difficulties with time management. And that looks a little bit more like ADHD in its presentation. And there is a little bit of research that talks about this new onset executive dysfunction at menopause. And again, that if it's new onset and it hasn't been there always. And then I think the third category is people who have always had ADHD characteristics, and they've managed them, but they've got to this point in their life where they just can't manage them anymore, and they've become more prominent. And that's the people who are seeking to understand what's happening and what their brain type is, and whether they meet diagnostic criteria for ADHD as a way of explaining what they're experiencing. And so I think that's a different category, because those people have had those symptoms characteristic always, but somehow manage, but they've got to a point where they can no longer manage anymore.
Yeah. And I see this a fair bit in my executive coaching work, particularly around, goal setting, motivation, emotional regulation, the whole kit and caboodle. And it's fascinating when you talk to people about the struts and supports that might have been in place in their life before, or the acceptance that they were, hyperactive and wired a little bit differently from everyone else. But as you say, the what we're noticing overwhelmingly is just the real struggle when they hit perimenopause.
Yes. And I didn't talk, you mentioned emotion regulation. I didn't talk about that, but that's a huge one that seems to pop up as being, and again, not part of the diagnostic criteria of ADHD, but such a prominent feature, particularly for women with ADHD, is a real challenge regulating emotions.
Yeah. And it's there must be a fair amount of conflation also with things like burnout, because it tends to happen at a time in a woman's life where, we've talked about previously them juggling so many things with work, with family, with responsibilities. It's really, the most extraordinary time to then feel like you're, cognitively impaired.
Yes. Yeah. I think, menopause is kind of that perfect storm in some ways, because there's brain change or hormone changes that might drive brain changes and a whole lot of symptoms for some people. And then it just happens, coincides in terms of life phase with a really busy time of people's lives, often in terms of like personal life. So there might be teenage children, elderly parents, managing households. And then professionally, that's when most people are at the peak of their career. So there's a lot happening, even if you take menopause out of the picture. So midlife is just a busy time in people's lives. And then you add in all these other things. So it does potentially, for lots of different reasons, create this point where some people are thriving and some people are at the burnout end.
Yeah, absolutely. So what impacts do you see in women who are diagnosed later in life?
So a few things. There can be lots of different emotions, I think, that people can experience that can range from like a sense of relief and understanding to a sense of grief and loss. So it can bring up lots of emotions, and sometimes they change over time. So initially when people receive a diagnosis, that might have this sense of like clarity and understanding, and it's like, oh, that all makes sense. And then people reflect on that, and then they think, if only I'd understood this earlier in my life. And they might think about all the different paths that their life might have taken had they had an understanding and a way to manage or a better way potentially to manage the symptoms that they still have but can no longer manage. Because even if people were managing up until the point of perimenopause, sometimes they haven't been managing particularly well, but it hasn't got to a point where they've reached out for professional help, but they've just kind of fumbled and struggled through and been okay. But it gets to the point where that's no longer working, but they think, oh, if only I'd known. So I feel like it can be a whole range of different emotions that vary between individuals, but then also within an individual over time, they can experience a range of different emotions. And I think it's always good for people to have someone to keep reflecting on what they're experiencing as they're understanding themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. So we'll come back a little bit later to management options and treatments and talk a little bit more about that. But I guess before we do, it'd be useful to couch that in sort of terms of what research is actually out there and available. And I note that you actually did a systematic review of the current research available. And I'd love to hear about what you found and what it means for the future of research around ADHD in menopausal women.
Yeah, so this was one of my PhD students, Alyssa Oceanlis, who conducted this systematic review, and we had a look at what's been done for any women or someone who's assigned female at birth, has a diagnosis of ADHD, and what happens to their ADHD symptoms at any point of hormonal change. So we looked at pregnancy, we looked at across the menstrual cycle, puberty, and menopause. And we found 11 studies in total, but in terms of menopause, we found 0 studies. So no one has researched the interaction, I guess, between perimenopause and ADHD. So it's a very untouched research space. But there's clinical discussion and there's lots of things on the internet, but not scientific evidence-based research that explores how perimenopause might impact ADHD symptoms. So there's really no research looking at either people's experiences or looking at how treatments, what sort of management treatment options have an evidence base. So it's a very blank space at the moment.
Which is exactly how we came to be doing this podcast. So a group of executive coaches, and we were wanting to develop science-informed tools for helping our clients, because quite often we get women coming for coaching who are considering actually leaving the workforce because they have this sort of debilitating brain fog, or they've recently been diagnosed with ADHD, and they just don't feel that they're up for it. So I guess I'm interested to know what's emerging from your work and your research to suggest what workplaces might be able to do to help women in these situations.
Yeah, so I think what we're discovering at the moment applies across anyone who is going through perimenopause who's struggling. So whether that is sort of a new onset cognitive symptoms, or whether it's long-standing ADHD that's just emerging. I think within the workplace, just being open to having discussions and acknowledging and validating people's experience is a really important first step. And knowing that people's, I guess, capacity and ability and knowledge, that doesn't seem to change. So whatever workplace environment you're in, even if you're struggling with your memory or with your attention or with your ability to plan, you need support, like, you know, an ADHD coach or executive coach or whatever sort of support you can get to help you manage. But you're generally, we don't see changes in people's core skills or intellect. So I think that's really important for people to know that it's the ability to perhaps follow through on things, or a whole range of different peripheral things that become impacted. But if people can get the right support, there's not necessarily a need for people to have to leave work or lessen their capacity at work. But there is often a need that people need some sort of help during that time to get them through for those who are struggling. So I think that's really important, that we don't paint this picture that anyone who's going through perimenopause is no longer able.
Should be put out to pasture.
Yeah, that is absolutely not the case. And there's a lot of hugely valuable people who remain hugely valuable in the workplace throughout their life and can bring it, you know, that important diversity that age and gender brings to a workplace, and we shouldn't forget that. But I think it's just acknowledging that, yeah, some people need support, particularly at this point in their lives, to ensure that they can, you know, thrive and do their best. So, and I think it's really individual as well. So within a workplace, though, I think it's just about having conversations, acknowledging, validating, and then really simple practical things. So if someone's struggling with their memory and they keep forgetting things, then it's important to put things in an email. So don't shout it out in the corridor. So then that person has to hold that bit of information in their working memory until they get back to their desk and write it down. And so the person who might be struggling just says, oh, can you just put that in an email and then I'll do it. Or someone might need help with prioritizing if they've got lots of demands that they have to get through in the course of the week. And that process of prioritization is something that they're struggling with. Someone to help say, look, these are the top 3 priorities for this week. That might be enough to help that person get through that week and know that, you know, how to prioritize, or how to break down tasks, or have an environment that's a little bit more distraction free rather than sort of open plan, loud, lots of noise and lights and people to distract people from whatever task they're doing. So yeah, I think it really varies, and lots of workplaces you know, can be incredibly different as well.
And lots of leaders, you know,
yes,
quite often I'm coaching leaders who have people with ADHD on their teams, and women, you know, in menopause with ADHD. And the suggestions you've just made there are so relevant for so many of them, about sort of couching work in a broader context, of really helping them with that goal and vision setting, right through to the prioritization and task planning. It's just, it's gold for leaders.
It is, and it is something that people can seek help. You don't have to just, you know, suffer and have and struggle through and feel like you're not coping, because that's not great. So I think it's important to know that there's so many resources and help that's available for people, and people should reach out if they're struggling.
Yeah. Thanks, Caroline. That's really great information, and actually leads me to my next question, which is, how can women advocate for themselves in conversations with doctors, especially if they feel the symptoms are being dismissed or misunderstood?
Yeah, and that's another common story that we hear. And I think it's because a couple of things. One, not all doctors are completely across menopause and the impacts of menopause and ADHD. So it brings together lots of different things. So if your doctor is someone who is not potentially understanding or doesn't have that skill set, it's not their primary area of specialty, and you feel dismissed, perhaps find a different doctor. I think that rather than trying to educate your doctor, perhaps just find a different doctor or healthcare professional who can provide you with better advice and more support. So, but I think the first set of step of that is kind of knowing in yourself that you are experiencing a certain range of symptoms that might be related to ADHD and or perimenopause or the interaction of those things. So I guess it comes back to the individual knowing within yourself that things have changed, and even if you're dismissed at the first person you see, just saying, no, in myself, I know that this is a change, and this change has happened in my 40s, and it might be, or, early 50s, and it could be related to hormone changes. It's something to consider. Or, it might not be. It might be related to life stressors that I'm experiencing. But I think just being aware that it's potentially the hormone changes, perimenopause might be a contributing factor. And if you dismiss the first person you see, just try and find...
Move on.
Move on, exactly, and try and find someone who will listen and help and work with you to ensure you get the best treatment available.
Yeah, but I'm very much hearing that that point of reflection and self-awareness is the Kickstarter, and then seeking appropriate support, and I guess having the tenacity and the confidence potentially to push through if you're at first rebuffed.
Yes, which is tough because
very at the time when you're not feeling great about yourself.
Exactly, might be feeling vulnerable, and you might, particularly if you're having difficulties with emotion regulation, or you've got heightened levels of like rejection sensitivity that people talk about, and then you get dismissed. That doesn't feel great for people. So it does take a lot of courage to say to yourself, no, I'm going to try again and try someone else and see how I go.
Yeah, even if it seems counterintuitive to start with, or you can't even find the words to describe what you're experiencing. Thank you. So I was really happy to hear your earlier comment that knowledge and skill is kind of protected. It's just a question of accessing it and recall for skills in the workplace. I'm curious to know more about the cognitive training work that you've been supervising, and I guess just to give our listeners the reassurance that their brain will adjust. And my question is, can it make up for lost ground? What have you found with the cognitive training?
Yeah, so I guess just to unpack that a bit, in terms of the neuropsychological research that we've done, where we assess people who are going through the perimenopause, menopause transition, and we assess cognition. So this is our work and work that we've reviewed that other people have done. And we see that most neuropsychological scores remain in normal limits. So it's not that people drop on areas like their ability to problem solve, or their speed of processing, or a whole range of different core cognitive skills. They don't seem to change, but we do see more of it's a subtle change that we see in learning efficiency or higher level attention skills or working memory. It's really subtle at a clinical level, but that can still have a significant impact on someone at an individual level. So I guess that's the neuropsychological profile that we see. So when someone's performing at their best in a very structured environment, their brain can still perform at whatever level they were performing at previously. And then in terms of sort of adaptation and cognitive training, we know that our brains can change all the time. So our brains have got that amazing ability to adapt to environments, to different neurochemical environments. Our brains are constantly able to change. And sometimes that's a negative thing when our brains change and aren't working as efficiently. But on the flip side, if we can provide our brains with the right training, we can strengthen certain brain pathways and enhance certain cognitive skills. So when we talk about cognitive training, there's probably two key, really broad areas. One is what we call compensatory cognitive training, where we compensate for some of the difficulties by changing our environment. So it might be that if you're someone who's struggling with memory, you might start to use memory aids. So, electronic calendars, diaries, reminder systems. You might really work on establishing a great calendar where there's lots of aspects of your life that are blocked out in your calendar, and you're not really relying on your memory to know what you need to do next. Or you might use lots of notes and reminders. So again, you're not relying on your memory to know what you have to buy at the shops. You've written it all down, and that's gone from your working memory. It's on a piece of paper in your diary, phone, And that's using these compensatory techniques. And we can also use those for executive function. So again, instead of relying on our brains to structure, to plan, to organize, to break down tasks, we do that externally. So we might, again, structure our week, structure our day on something visual like paper or, again, an external diary. And then within each task, we might break it down and prioritize it. And sometimes people might need a bit of external assistance, someone to help or coach them through that process of putting things out of your head and using external aids. Sometimes people are okay doing it within themselves, but then it just takes that pressure off our brains and our minds to use our executive functions, use our memory, and that can be a really helpful strategy to ensure that you can, perform at your best. So that's the compensatory aspects. And then we can also do more sort of brain training, which is where we practice tasks and we get better at tasks that we practice. Like, anything in life, the more you do something, the better you get at that. And sometimes some of those cognitive training tasks, they don't always translate or broaden beyond the tasks that you keep practicing. So it might mean that if we keep practicing a certain memory task, we get really good at that memory task, but it might not generalize to every single memory task that we're doing. But we can still strengthen our brain pathways and strengthen our ability to do things by practice. So I guess they're the two sorts of cognitive trainings that we tend to do. And in the cognitive training programs that we have been doing, they're even broader, I guess, because they introduce these compensatory techniques as well as some practice and some strategies. So, for example, if you're trying to remember things, to use things like visualization to help remember things and to learn new pieces of information, or active attention. So you're really paying attention to something and you're really focused and you keep using either self-talk or something visual to bring you back to the task so your mind doesn't wander. So a range of those kind of practical compensatory and drill-based kind of training. And then I think it's also another important part of broad cognitive training is education. Like, how does memory work? How does the brain work? What happens when we're stressed and really emotional? And why doesn't our executive function work so well when we're super stressed and emotional and we keep making stupid decisions that are emotionally driven rather than thought through? And so we also, I think another important part is talking about how does the brain work? How can that change at times of stress? How can that change at times of hormonal change? And then the third or fourth layer, or whatever we're up to, that's really important is lifestyle factors that have a huge influence over mood and cognition, which are all the usual ones of, good sleep, making sure we exercise, making sure we're socially connected with people, making sure we use our brains. So all of those lifestyle things are also a really important component of being able to, use our cognitive skills and perform at our best and feel best at our best as well.
Yeah. Thank you. That is an incredibly useful rap sheet of information that would be of great assistance. And I was going to selfishly ask you, how might executive coaches and leaders support people in this stage of their life, ADHD, people suffering the dual symptoms, I guess, of ADHD and menopause. And I understand that you've just spoken at length about all the different things we could do, but what is one thing that you would like coaches and leaders to maybe take away that would best support?
I think becoming that person's executive function for a short period of time, I feel like that is the primary role. And that's often what people with ADHD and perimenopause talk about struggling the most with is those executive functions, the ability to regulate, plan, time manage, all of those executive skills. So to support that, having an executive coach to be the executive functions for a period of time can be the missing link that kind of gets people through and supports people, and then they can do all the amazing core cognitive or workplace,
tap into all the stuff that they've got in there. They just can't access it.
Yes,
struggle
exactly.
to access it.
Yes.
Which leads me to the next question. What happens post-menopause? Do you get the executive functioning back, please?
Such a good question.
Tell me.
So My hunch is yes, but in terms of evidence-based science, what do we actually know? There's not very many studies at all. Again, there's nothing in that interaction between ADHD and menopause transition, but just in the menopause transition, there's very few prospective studies that really look at what happens to cognition and brain function from within the same person, from those reproductive premenopause years to menopause to postmenopause. So we don't really know, but our hunch based on kind of pulling what we do have together is that our brains adapt postmenopause. So our brains adapt to having lower levels of estrogen in postmenopausal years and to being, in this new postmenopausal state, and people do well again. So that's what our hunch is based on what we do know, but there's not a really good scientific evidence base for that. But I think, and just anecdotally, most people report that they kind of bounce back in postmenopausal years, and there's an adaptation. So that's our feeling, but it's not heavily based in science at this point in time.
No, thank you. That's very reassuring. The impression I'm getting is that the research is sort of starting younger with the younger cohorts, sort of further down the chain, and then it's a bit like a wave, then it's eventually going to get to menopausal, and kind of, I guess, postmenopausal is last cab off the rank. But yeah, it was
there is a lot of research in postmenopausal women looking at cognition, but they haven't got the history behind them. And so that's where that gap is, of that really, like that longitudinal tracking across time to really know what that pattern looks like.
And potentially the threat of ADHD, given it's a relatively new phenomenon in females.
Yes, exactly. So time will tell.
Okay, thank you. I had a couple of other questions and I just wish that I could retrieve them, but there we go. Oh, yes. So one I was interested in, I guess it springboards off that last question about what happens post-menopause, is just if our listeners were to want to support your research or get involved in some citizen science around this, provide some anecdotal feedback, what's the best way for them to do that?
So probably connecting with us through our website would be the best way. Do you have show notes that I could give you?
Yes, absolutely.
So if I can give you just a link to our website, which has got all of our research studies because they change all the time, that would probably be the best way of linking in to know what we're doing. And as you say, citizen science, like, it's so important for us to have people informing our research so we know what's relevant to people and what's important. So that would be the best way for people contributing to our research in some way, would be through our website.
Okay, brilliant. Look, Caroline, this has been so helpful. Is there any last message you'd like to leave anyone struggling with menopause and ADHD?
The message I always like to leave is to not struggle. So seek help. So if you're someone who is struggling with either your mood, or you feel like your ADHD's got a whole lot worse, or you're struggling regulating your emotions, whatever it is that you're struggling with, seek help and have confidence in your experiences and your own awareness of what you're experiencing to find the right help and support, because it does exist. There is plenty of different options of help and support out there, but you just need to find it so you can then be in a position where you can thrive, but often you need help first.
Fantastic. Thank you, Caroline. So I guess that brings this to an end, but I really appreciate you taking the time to take us through all of that. It was incredibly insightful. We will share the links to the resources.
That would be
in
really
the show
good.
notes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And if any one of our listeners have any questions or any topics they'd like to have covered in future episodes, you can email us at support@thefogandthefury.com. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you all next time. And Caroline, thank you. And I'd love to think that in a year's time we could invite you back and there might be even more research to talk about, or some more insights that you might be able to provide a little bit further down the track.
Yes, hope so. Love to come back and hopefully share more.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And we will see you soon.